We are living in a day and age where international courts and international human rights organizations claim to be for the advancement of human rights are actively choosing to turn a blind eye to Netanyahu's war crimes. They are actively choosing to ignore his war crimes, actively choosing to ignore a genocide, and actively choosing to ignore an apartheid state. And it's something that we've been seeing going on for decades. It's not new. It didn't just start in 2023. It's been happening since the reign of the apartheid state that is currently taking place over Palestine. And since the international community is choosing to ignore this, in light of that, here is a list of every rule and restriction that Israel has imposed over the civilians of Gaza and reasons why Netanyahu must be arrested as a war criminal. Because this list is so long, I'm probably going to have to do this video in several parts, but I'm just going to start with the facts, and it will probably have to be broken up into several parts. Number one is surveillance and facial recognition. Israel employs cameras and facial recognition technology such as Blue Wolf to monitor Palestinians in the West Bank. This is widely known by international communities, and it includes capturing photos of Palestinians, including children and the elderly, for a database. It includes face scanning cameras as a part of a wider surveillance network. Next, we have the use of drones and spyware. Drones are also employed for tear gas and attacks on millions of Palestinian civilians, causing high anxiety rates amongst Palestinian people. Israel also uses powerful spyware like Pegasus to spy on the Palestinian smartphones, so that if they find anything that is against genocide and calling for people to stop killing Palestinians, they can and will arrest Palestinian people. Next, we have the employment of collaborators. So Israel uses collaborators for spying and inciting conflict amongst Palestinians. It's often done under coercion, involving the threats of violent imprisonment or blackmail. So it's not usually people willing to be informants, it's people who are being blackmailed and threatening to have their family killed. Next, we have monitoring of social media, which I mentioned earlier. So Palestinian social media activities are closely monitored, with arrests for posts that encourage resistance. So this is where freedom of speech is non-existent, and this is where journalists like Bisan and Mota are really endangered. Their only way of broadcasting what's happening to them and the genocide and the brutality that's taking place to the outside world is social media. And as you know, the IDF loves launching propaganda campaigns and loves putting out propaganda media. So when Palestinians try to counter that propaganda with the actual reality footage of what is happening, so when Palestinians try to counter that propaganda that's being put out with the actual reality of what's occurring in their real-time social media footage, they are subject to arrests. Many tech companies that are involved in Israel are pressured to censor pro-Palestinian content, and leading to account suspension and content restriction that is directly stopping the truth from getting out. Next, we have biometric ID cards and movement control. So Palestinians are required to carry color-coded Israeli-issue ID cards, which impact their freedom of movement and residency rights, a direct war crime. And the population registry that I mentioned earlier, which is their database, is used to control these movements. Next, we have the physical obstacles for movement, which is the fact that Palestine is an open-air prison. So we have walls, military checkpoints, and other obstacles that limit Palestinian movement within the West Bank. There's also a huge network of Israeli-only highways within the West Bank that further restricts movement. And you can really think of it like what has happened in South Africa apartheid, with segregation and whites only areas. Next, we have the naval blockade of Gaza. So Israel's siege and naval blockade prevents Palestinians in Gaza from leaving and impacts their ability to work, to study, to even receive medical treatment outside of Gaza. So fishermen are restricted from accessing productive fishing grounds, and this affects their food sources, it affects their education, it restricts any type of peacefulness. Even if the ceasefire were to stop, life under apartheid would not be peaceful. You would still see these restrictions in your everyday life, down to food, education, medical aspects, which is again why we need to call beyond a ceasefire and an end to an apartheid state. Now, the next rule we have is restricting access to Jerusalem. So most Palestinians are denied travel to East Jerusalem for family visits, business, or even worship. On top of that, we have the denial of Palestinians' rights to visit their own homeland. So Palestinians living outside of Palestine are largely prevented from returning or visiting their homeland, which is now considered Israel. Then we have a total blockade of Gaza. So a total blockade implemented in October 2023 blocked the entry of essential goods like food, water, medicine, and fuel. Next, we have the closure of the only power plant within Palestine. The blockade led to the shutdown of Gaza's only power plant and caused a loss of electricity and affected water supply. So again, people couldn't share how they were being brutalized and what was really happening in real time on social media because they cut off electricity naturally. Then we have the shutdown of Gaza's only cancer hospital. The Turkish Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which is Gaza's only cancer hospital, was forced to shut down due to this exact blockade. And I just think this was one of the most evil. Every act has been evil, but this was truly sinister and, again, a war crime. Then we have the limitation on aid vehicles. So we have restrictive checks at crossing that limited the flow of aid to get into Gaza to help people since the hospitals were shut down. So there was no hospitals that people could go to, and there were no aid that could get through these blockades. Again, which Netanyahu purposely did to lead to more casualties and higher deaths. Next, we have international condemnation. So there are a very limited, which is so sad to say, humanitarian organizations that have spoke up and have condemned Israel and said this is a violation of international law. So international courts really need to listen to those few voices that are courageous enough and brave enough to speak out, because there are some organizations who have clearly outlined clause by clause how this is a violation of international law. Moving on to the new West Bank entry guidelines. So in 2022, Israel implemented new guidelines that made it difficult for foreigners to enter the West Bank to teach, to study, to volunteer, to work, and just to live, further isolating Palestinians from global civil society and family members who lacked a West Bank ID. Next, we have denial of entry permits. So Israeli authorities denied entry permits for specific individuals, including human rights workers, citing broad authority over entry. Again, we have the West Bank permit restrictions. So West Bank entry permits are only granted to limited categories of visitors, with stringent procedures for academics, students, volunteers, and experts, and others are often in. Next, we have restrictions on long-term stay. So these new guidelines for closed paths for foreigners and exempt spouses of Palestinians to remain long-term in the West Bank. Next, we have the direct violation of international law. Human Rights Watch argues that these restrictions violate international humanitarian law, which requires an occupying power to act in the best interest of the occupied population, which we clearly see they are not. Next, we have the impact on Palestinian life. The restrictions impact family life and block entry of academics and NGO workers, affecting social, cultural, political, and intellectual life in the West Bank. Next, we have the hardships on Palestinians. So the policies exacerbated hardship by denying residency rights, imposing movement restrictions, and attacking Palestinian civil society, and it ultimately contributes to apartheid and persecution. Next, we have Israeli control over Palestinian life. So the policies that I've just spoken about illustrate Israeli control over various aspects of Palestinian life, including academia and just everyday family units. Next, we have the torture and the humiliation of detainees. Detainees, including children, have faced severe beatings, humiliation, and other forms of torture, such as being forced to sing Israeli songs and kneel on the floor during inmate count. Next, we have the deaths in detention. 4 Palestinian detainees died in Israeli detention facilities in circumstances that have not been impartially investigated. Next, we have the restriction on falsely prosecuted prisoners during the state of emergency. So Israeli authorities have imposed harsh conditions on prisoners, which we know, and that includes cutting off water and electricity for long hours and denying outdoor exercise. This is literally a torture mechanism and a torture vehicle. Then we have the arrests on Palestinian children. So as of September 2023, 146 Palestinian minors were held in Israeli custody on security grounds, with an estimated 500 to 700 children detained annually. That means around 13,000 Palestinian children have been detained since 2000 alone. Next, we have the abuse of Palestinian minors in detention. Palestinian minors in Israel detention endure physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, including beatings, strip searches, and injuries at the point of arrest. Next, we have the systemic prosecution of minors in military courts. Israel is the only country that systemically prosecutes minors in military courts, with stone throwing being a common charge carrying a 20-year sentence. Next, we have the amendment to prosecute young children. In 2016, Israel amended a law to charge children under 14 with crimes like attempted murder, a move that has been criticized by millions of human rights groups and millions of human beings all over the world. Next, we have the military detention system. Palestinian children in the West Bank are subjected to an Israeli military detention system that denies them basic rights. This system has been in place since 1967, when Israel occupied the territory following the Six-Day War. Next, we have the systematic prosecution in military courts. Israel is the only country that automatically and systematically prosecutes children in military courts, lacking fundamental fair trial rights and protections. Annually, between 500 and 700 Palestinian children are prosecuted in these courts, and those numbers are on the low end. Next, we have treatment during interrogation. Children often arrive for interrogation bound, blindfolded, frightened, and sleep deprived, and commonly give confessions after verbal abuse, threats, and violence. Israeli military law provides no right to legal counsel during interrogation, and confessions obtained through coercion or torture are seldom, never actually excluded by military court judges. They are always used by military court judges. Next, we have statistics on detained children. So from 2016 to 2022, testimonies of 766 Palestinian children detained by Israeli forces showed that 75% experienced physical violence post-arrest. 97 showed that 75% experienced physical violence post-arrest. 97% were hand-tied. 89% were blindfolded, and 80% were strip searched. Additionally, 59% were detained from their homes at night, and 25% were subjected to stress positions. Next, we have detention since 2000. An estimated 13,000 Palestinian children have been detained by Israeli forces from the occupied West Bank and held in the Israeli military detention system since the year 2000. Despite Israel's ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, which mandates that children's liberty should be a measure of last resort, these detentions continue, often including torture, rape, and cruel treatment. Next, we have the Youth Bill for Child Terrorists. The Israeli parliament passed a law allowing children as young as 12 to be jailed for crimes such as murder, attempted murder, and manslaughter. Next, we have cosmetic reform. So despite international engagement and calls to end the night arrests and ill treatment of Palestinian children in Israel military detention centers, Israeli authorities have largely failed to implement substantive changes, with reforms tending to be cosmetic rather than addressing the underlying issues of physical violence and torture and genocide. Now, I'm not even halfway through the list of war crimes and list of restrictive laws that Netanyahu and Israel has opposed over the Palestinian people, but I hope this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with and the current state of what is happening to the Palestinian people and the current state of the genocide. I am calling on whoever sees this, whoever watching this, please help us free Palestine. Your voice matters. A simple post, a simple signing of a ceasefire letter, a simple protest at your wherever you see your politicians out and about, because they should not have rest. They are public servants and they have not served the public inception of the government, I'd say. But yeah, we can't let this happen, and we have to unite. We have to hold politicians accountable. We have to hold apex and lobbyists accountable, because that's often why politicians vote the way they do. We have to somehow eradicate these lobbyists that are influencing elections and influencing getting politicians in who support genocide and vote in favor of genocide. There's so much work to be done, and I don't want this to be overwhelming to anyone. I just want this to be a wake-up call that you can make change, no matter whether it's a post, no matter it's going to a protest, a sit-in. Please do it. Please do not be frightened by their McCarthyism. Please do not be frightened by the fear of losing monetary gain, or the systems that capitalism wants us to fear and wants us to tie ourselves to. Please don't, because we are so much bigger than that, and we will win.